So looking at cloth simulation, we decided to do a quick test on a project that everybody should be a little bit familiar with, and that's the Gates project in New York City. Looks something like this. That's a conceptual sketch. And then if we move down through some of the conceptual sketches, there's the final project. And, starting out in cloth simulation, we're not going to look at doing anything as advanced as the pleating or sort of the lining, some of the weighting that happens in the fabric to help it flow a certain way. I just want to get the basic effects for a shot started, and not just these things blowing in the wind, but also the sort of quality of wind passing through and affecting different gates at different times. So we're starting out a scene here with one gate right here, and what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and copy this guy to make a series of gates. Now, I want to make sure that I'm using a copy. If I use instance or reference, once I start actually modifying one and running a cloth simulation on one, it's actually going to run the exact same simulation on each gate thereafter. So in other words, I'll have, let's say, a total of 4 or 5 gates moving the exact same way, which is exactly the effect that I don't want. I want them all sort of blowing in the breeze separately. So I've actually got to set this up as copies. And once I have the copies done, then I'll need to be able to run the simulation on each individual piece. So let's go ahead and let's start with this first guy right here. And the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to add a cloth modifier. And then I'm going to expand the cloth modifier and look at the group. And I'm going to select the top 2 rows of vertices. I'm going to say make group. I'm going to call that group fixed. And right here in this list where it says fixed unassigned, I'm going to say fixed preserve. Essentially that means preserve the location of those points. Do not move any place after those points. The next thing that I'm going to do is I am going to go ahead and go back to the cloth, and I'm going to look at its properties. So with that selected, I'm going to say cloth. I'm going to turn the cloth properties on, so I'm shifting its status from inactive to cloth, and I'm going to use silk. I want it to be very flowy, very fluid. I want sort of a light breeze to have a big impact. I've modeled this at scale, so I'm not going to do anything in terms of modifying the overall scale, which you can work with right here, the U and V scale. I could probably bump that up or down to get a more dramatic effect. But this, again, just looking at kind of getting the effects on this particular shot started and how well they're going to work. So I'm going to go ahead and say OK to that. And now I need to go ahead and add in 2 forces as well. So I'm going to go to my Create tab, Systems. I'm going to add in a gravity. Just aiming down, and then I'm going to add in a wind effect. And I'm going to position it someplace up here, and I'm going to rotate it so that it is moving across at an angle between all my gates. So I'm building something a little bit like this. I'm going to go ahead and move that up as well. Right now it's just a global wind setting, but I'm actually going to turn that into something that's more localized here in just a few minutes. So right now, if I look at that wind, I need to look at its properties. I'm going to go ahead and set the strength of the wind to 3. I'm not going to establish a decay yet, but that's what's going to allow me to affect each piece of fabric independently. I'm going to go ahead and set the turbulence to 10. And that's going to allow me to have a lot of variation in terms of how the wind is blowing. I don't want to just sort of blowing consistently across. And I'm going to set my frequency at 1. So what I should be able to do now at this point, just as simple as that setup is, I should be able to come in and add 2 forces to my first piece of cloth here to test and see how well the situation is working. So I'm going to go to Cloth Forces, and I'm going to add both gravity and wind and say OK. And now I should be able to run Simulate. And you can see that I'm getting an immediate result from that. Really, really simple and basic to set up. Okay, so with that done, I need to go ahead and apply that same process to each one of the gates. So if you can bear with me, I'm going to do that really fast. So again, the first step is cloth modifier, group, top 2 rows of vertices, and preserve. Now, ideally, it would be great if once I have this done, I could just copy with this system in place. For some reason, and I'm not sure why, that doesn't work. If somebody knows how to get that working, please post me. I'll update the tutorial and get that working. But for right now, the best way that I know how to go about doing this is to actually go through and do one at a time, which is a little bit tedious, but you know, really, all things considered, try and animate that cloth moving by hand. So again, I'm going to go cloth forces, add both of those in. I'm going to make sure that I did add those in. There we go. Okay. And then I'm going to repeat the process again. And that reminds me, on this first one, I need to go back to cloth properties and make sure it's acting as a cloth that is silk. Okay. Two more. Okay, so I have all of those set. Now I should be able to select each one of these guys and run simulate on it. And again, they're going to move in a really similar way. And that's primarily because they're all using this same global wind. And I could give each one a little bit more variation somehow or another, you know, to help remedy that. But the reality is they all are referencing the same global wind, and this is a computed process. So we're going to see them act and behave, you know, pretty much the exact same way for each piece. So what we're going to do is, and I actually want to get this idea of wind moving through the gates as well, sort of starting at one end and working towards the other. Even if that's sort of a fictional approach, that's sort of going to show the drama of the scene that we're wanting to get at. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and select these guys, and let's erase the simulation. And I'm going to make a modifier to the actual wind source right here. So this time I'm going to go ahead and give this a decay of 0.01. And I'm actually going to show range indicators as well. So now I can see that the wind is actually working in not a global fashion, but in a local fashion. So if I select this first gate right here and run simulate, we're going to see gravity take hold of it. but we're not going to see it actually be affected hardly at all by the wind because the wind actually has quite a substantial amount of fall off. So what I'm going to go ahead and do next is erase that simulation one more time. I'm going to select my wind, and let's animate it on a path moving across the gates. So for that, I'm just going to turn on auto key. I'm going to establish my base point there as my first keyframe. Oh, I just established it as my last keyframe. Let's change that. Move my shuttle back to the beginning. There's my first keyframe. Let's do one at 50. Something like this. Let's do one more at 100. Something like that. So now I have my wind on an animated path. So the next thing we want to do is rerun the simulations. And so what you can start to see now is there's sort of a rippling push effect because the wind is now localized as it moves through each one. 2 more to go. And last one. So while this is setting up to do the last one, there's one more effect that I want to go ahead and do with wind and fabric on this one. And that is, I can also use the fabric system to have things sort of blowing up and into the air as well. So let's just pretend like this is a little leaf right here. And I'm going to add a cloth property to it as well. And so how I'm going to work that is I'm going to go ahead and make just a few copies of this. This would be something that maybe you'd have to do times 40 or so. I don't know. So maybe it's a little bit brutal. I'm just going to do 3 for right now. So again, just using copy. And I'm going to select one of these guys. And again, I'm going to go ahead and add a cloth modifier to it. And on that cloth modifier, I'm going to go to its object properties. I'm going to turn it to a cloth, and I am going to call it burlap. Much more rigid than silk, still a little bit bendy and twisty so that things look fluid. But, we want to kind of keep it simple. So now I've got one other thing that I want to do with this, though, and that is I actually want to go ahead and tell the system to actually collide with the ground plane. If I look at my scene, I've got these guys, these leaves, floating up above the ground plane. And I'm actually going to let gravity do its job for the final placement between here and the ground plane. So let me go back to selecting just one of these guys. Let's select the one that has the cloth modifier on it. There we go. Go back to object properties. And one of the things I need to do is add in a collision object this time. So I'm going to go ahead and say add objects. Well, let's select the ground plane and say add. And so the leaf test piece is going to be cloth burlap. The ground plane is going to be a collision object. So let's check that really quick. Ground plane, collision, leaf test, cloth, burlap. And I'm going to say OK. So what that allows me to do now at this point is when I simulate, it should drop and collide with the ground. Just like that. So the next thing that I want to do is let's go ahead and set up another wind system that actually pushes that up in the air, that basically runs at the same time as this wind comes across. So as the wind is coming across, we actually get this ground effect of things blowing up in the air as well. So what I'm going to do with that is I'm going to build one more wind piece. I'm going to position it here. I'm going to rotate it so that it is blowing in the upward direction and a little bit across as well, something kind of like that. I'm going to go to its properties, and I actually want it blowing up fairly, you know, with quite a bit of force. So I'm going to set its force at 30. I'm going to set its decay at 0.1, its turbulence at 2, and the frequency at 1. I'm hoping that I've got that. I might have to go back and rerun this with the decay one more time, but we'll see how well that's going to work here. So right now on this piece right here on the leaf, I'm actually going to go ahead and I want to make sure that on my cloth forces that I'm only looking at wind number 2. So I'm going to move that into the forces and simulation and say OK. And then we're going to run simulate again. So I should see that drop to the ground. Well, what would help is if I took that and erased the simulation first. There we go. Simulate. I should see it drop to the ground. Perfect. Cancel. I need to go ahead and set up this as an animation. So I'm going to go ahead and say this guy is going to, again, it's going to animate moving across with this other wind piece right here. So I'm going to turn on auto key, establish my first keyframe. I'm going to move again to about 50. And I just want it to sort of track with this other wind location. And then to 100. Just like that. So let's go back to my test piece here. Erase simulation, simulate. It should drop to the ground. And hopefully as the wind passes over, it's actually going to pick it up and move it away. You know, the simulation right there, I'd like to see something that's a little bit more dramatic. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to modify that decay one more time, and hopefully we get something a little bit closer. But it's going to be that decay that really helps establish how much impact it has. So I'm going to modify that all the way back up to 1. And let's rerun that simulation one more time. Yeah, again, not as dramatic as an impact as I would like. We'll give it one more shot. Erase simulation. I'm going to select that wind piece again. Let's go the other direction with this, 0.01. Make sure I was heading the right direction. And you can see what's happened now is I've actually gone too far. So let's go back one more time. One more time again. I know, that's the life of an animator. And let's just set it at 0.1. And we'll leave it as good enough for right now, knowing that I can come back and tweak this a little bit. So I'm going to say erase simulation and simulate. So now you might wonder about, you know, the leaves and things falling to the ground. You know, anytime that you're running an effects-based piece of animation, you always want to have a little bit of a ramp up into your scene. You know, so as you can see, the fabric is actually stretching here early on, and it reaches sort of a constant state, and it even has a little bit of a bounce to it. So I would say on an animation like this, your first frame that you're going to render out as part of your final animation is probably somewhere right around in 30 or so. And that's really typical for any sort of effects-based animation where you're running a simulation. You want everything to reach sort of a common state first, and then you actually want to go ahead and start your renders. So that is your introduction to cloth simulation effects.